The strangers from the internet are standing outside. The strangers from the internet have come from far and wide. But I cannot receive them. I hardly believe in them.
Hello, and welcome back to Shadow Yaddo. I'm Elena Richardson. Today, we're focusing on the importance of experimentation. Yaddo's co-founders, Spencer and Katrina Trask, were great tinkerers. They'd plant an alley of trees, and if it didn't take, they'd do something else. They built a storybook tower to use as an ice house. When it proved to be hopelessly designed for that task, they made it into a chapel. There's a long list of examples. And in 1926, Yaddo itself was hailed by the New York Times as a unique experiment which has no exact parallel in the world of fine arts. Today, artists from all backgrounds and nations come to Yaddo for the time, space, and freedom to innovate and play with ideas, to plant something and then plant again if it doesn't take. We'll be hearing some early work by artists who are now torchbearers in their fields. Miranda July shares a story from 2003, which ran on the experimental radio show The Next Big Thing. Back then, she was credited not as filmmaker, performance artist, author, whatever, but simply as sound artist. But first, we'll hear from writer and director Adam Goldman, whose critically acclaimed web series, The Outs, which tells the story of Mitchell, played by Adam, his best friend Una, and his ex-boyfriend Jack. It debuted in 2012 with a run of 6 episodes, followed by a Hanukkah special in 2013 and a second season in 2016. This was the early days of streaming, back when everyone told him, no one's going to watch television online. Haha. Here's Adam speaking with our very own wonderful Christy Albano.
Then I woke up and the sun was shining on the house beside the lake, and the dog was barking, but the baby didn't wake through it all. Why would she? Hello, send my regards to New York.
You were one of the early people who experimented with online television, and I'm wondering if you'll tell me a little bit about how that started.
Yeah, it was 2011 or 2012, and my roommate and I were sort of out of work writers and actors, and we just decided that we wanted to make something as sort of a resume piece for ourselves to prove that we could do it at all. So we wrote the first episode of The Outs, which was, 12 minutes long. And just for a little bit of context, this was right around the time when House of Cards was coming out on Netflix. The whole idea that you would watch a television-length thing on your computer was totally unheard of, and people didn't really get it. And even for us, this thing that was 10 or 11 minutes long, people said, well, nobody wants to watch that. It was not something that was done. And we kind of said, first of all, we were sort of treating it like a short film, basically. The idea was that we would get to do more episodes if anybody liked it, which fortunately they did, but we just said we're going to make it. The idea of even calling it television, of calling it indie TV, which we did at the time, hadn't really landed on us yet. I think just over time, as our show was coming out over the next 2 years or year and a half, whatever, that idea sort of became more comfortable to people. We also had this funny advantage that it was quite intimate, where if you're watching something across the room on your television, it's a little further from you. If you're watching something curled up in bed at night on your laptop, it's closer to you in a funny way. And so gradually we kept making things, and we got to do another season of The Outs, and by that point, streaming was sort of in full swing. But yeah, and if you told me back then in 2012, hey, in 8 years, in 2020, Disney is going to be focusing $1 billion on making streaming television that will never be on terrestrial TV, I would have laughed you out of the room, but that's where everything was going.
And what I love about the work of yours that I've watched is that it's not as if you were adapting like a traditional television show. It's like exploring its own medium. As you mentioned, there's more of a sense of intimacy. I love how the dialogue lingers in a way, and it feels like you're in the room with the roommates.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. People have said, oh, it's how much of that was improvised or whatever. And it's like, no, it's all written. And, I think that there was some quote from one of our actors where they said, do you play around with the dialogue? And he said, no, Adam's kind of a fascist about that or something, which, it's just written. We wanted to write something that was rewarding for an engaged audience, And I think that's also reflected in terms of the length of the episodes in that first season of The Outs. The first one is 12 minutes long. The last one is 45 minutes long because we got people engaged, and every episode is as long as the story needs to be. And because we were doing it independently, because we didn't have to worry about commercial breaks or sort of standard episode lengths, we had that freedom and we got to experiment a lot. And I think you see that a little bit these days with shows on Netflix or other streaming platforms, that some episodes will be 22 minutes and sometimes they'll be 30 minutes. And it's a great level of freedom to have, but it was, for us, it was obviously very exaggerated. Nobody was going to let you, even in this day and age, get away with a 12-minute episode of something, but we were limited, so we did that, and it happened to work out.
I'm thinking about the experimentation factor when you're first writing or making something, especially in the early days. Did you have any epic fails?
Not like top line stuff. I mean, I guess I would say, there's one episode of The Outs that we were shooting at my apartment, which is in Crown Heights, and there was a huge neighborhood parade that came through on the day that we were shooting that I just hadn't planned for, and it was outside my window. I mean, it was on my corner. And I remember sort of being in tears about that because it was just totally ruining the sound, and in the end we sort of edited around it, and our sound designer did a bunch of fancy footwork, and you really only can hear it if you're sort of listening to it. But we were just sort of throwing everything at the wall with The Outs, and it just happened to work. Luckily, not a lot of epic fails, just a lot of little fails.
And the series, whatever this is, which I also love, I think maybe Frances Ha, that film about the dancer who's always broke, comes pretty close. But otherwise, I haven't seen the real day-to-day struggle of young people in New York City. It's really like that. You really you run out of money and you're depending on your roommate or your friends, or you don't eat, I found that very resonant.
Yeah, and we were used to working these jobs that were just sort of thankless. I mean, none of these jobs and those characters and whatever it is, they're not mining blood diamonds. I mean, it's not life or death, but it is that there's this sense of sort of throwing yourself up against the city and trying to make it work. And those characters are in specific situations. One of them is a teacher, two of them are trying to be production people, and they end up as production assistants. And those are really thankless, underpaid jobs if they're paid at all. And that was a funny one where it was an evolution after The Outs, where we said, okay, well, what if we did something that sort of self-consciously was half-hour episodes? It's going to look as good and sound as good as anything that's on HBO, which it did, at the time. That was another thing where my agent at the time, I said, what about this show? We've shot some of it. And they said, well, nobody wants to watch a streaming television show, and it was so foolish and short-sighted. And it just sort of didn't land the same way that The Outs did, but I really love that show.
And again, there's a conversation in there where one of the characters is talking about bed bugs, which I had experience with a couple of times. And I just loved that scene because she never says, but she's like, they should call them everywhere bugs. It's just you come in mid-conversation. I know exactly what she's talking about.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's obviously an element of with The Outs and with whatever this is, we're dealing with a lot of queer subject matter, or at that time subject matter about young people. And I feel other than girls and that sort of first vanguard of young people expressing ourselves in this medium, there wasn't a lot of that. And indie platforms are frequently tied, or less viewed or more innovative platforms are frequently tied to marginalized communities expressing themselves. Even something you look at The Good Fight on CBS All Access, not exactly an indie platform, but it's not linear, as we call it. It's not linear television. It's only online. They got to say a lot of incredibly politically charged stuff about Donald Trump that was not appearing on CBS terrestrial on the regular TV programming, because there's just a certain level of freedom. And there's also a sense that if you can attract these marginalized communities to your platform, that sort of starts the snowball going. And interestingly, that's happening now during the pandemic. That's happening with podcasting in really interesting ways. And I feel that's kind of in the same way that we sort of bootstrapped ourselves and said, we're just going to make this thing ourselves with The Outs. Now it's oh, well, we can do that. You can make an even simpler pilot or an even simpler proof of concept as a podcast. And we've seen a lot of examples of podcasts getting picked up and getting adapted into television, into movies, that sort of thing.
Right. I hadn't thought about that. So I imagine that when the Outs came out, you were moving from a place of not necessarily having those opportunities, and then opportunities present themselves, or people see how amazing your work is. What was that like? How did that change your life?
It's been so up and down, and I think that's just the story of everybody, any artist, especially in America, just in a culture that places so little value on art and on artistic output. In the period between the Outs and whatever this is, we got invited to the White House, to this LGBT Pride Month event at the White House, and that was really incredible. The Obama White House, back when that was a thing that anybody wanted. Wow, like how do you top this? Everything is changing. And then for Sasha Winters and I, who was sort of my co-creator on the Outs, we both sort of went back to having day jobs and pounding the pavement and that sort of thing. And it's been a really gradual climb uphill. That being said, the relationships that I built on the Outs, that's still such an important calling card for me, and it's work that I'm really proud of, and that has led to a lot of other opportunities. But it wasn't something where it was just like the floodgates were open. Now, I think that probably has something to do with the nature of the content. Making queer storytelling is always an uphill battle, and it happens to be the case that a large focus of mine is telling the stories of queer people who I find to be incredibly interesting. Not to say more interesting than my straight counterparts, but maybe. But so I don't know. It changed my life, but not in necessarily a permanent way.
And how do you view experimentation now? I mean, do you consciously decide to experiment with something, or is the process more organic?
I think it sort of taught me to tell the story however the story needs to be told. Just to not close your mind to any particular method or medium. So for example, I'm working on a podcast project right now with Audible, and that's the kind of thing where it was like, well, what is this, a feature film? Is this a TV series? Oh, it's a podcast. How do we sort of tailor that to make it fit that medium the best? How do we play with that and have fun with that? And whereas I think a few years ago there would have been this idea that, a narrative podcast, what is that? Who would listen to that? And then you fast forward to now, and it's like, well, okay, everybody is listening to podcasts 24/7. They need a little variety. You can't listen to the daily all day. There's no right way to do anything. And kind of this is my sort of guiding artistic principle, and in life is something that my sister said to me years ago, which is you can get away with anything you can get away with. Anything you can't get away with, you didn't get away with it. It sounds like a tautology, but it's like nothing is impossible. It's just about finding the right way in. And so you have to, whatever that way is, if that's in using a different medium, if it's in writing something differently, producing something differently, it's just about finding exactly the right key to doing it.
Have you noticed during this pandemic time, has it impacted the way that you create work?
It's felt pretty bleak. I mean, to be honest, God willing, the end is sort of in sight, and you can sort of see, even if it's 6 months down the line, if it's 10 months down the line, that the gears starting to turn again. That's inspiring, but everything really shut down. And, maybe, you can use that emotion for something productive, but it's been hard, particularly the idea of producing something for after the pandemic when we don't know what the world is going to look like. When you're writing something, there's a fundamental understanding that you're writing it for a world that everybody knows what that world looks like. And this has shaken the Etch-a-Sketch so much that it's really hard. And I think the solution for me on some things, and I heard Stephen King talking about this, he just said, well, I just said it in 2018. And that's a totally valid answer, but it's really hard to project forward and say, okay, I'm writing a scene in a restaurant. It's 2022. What does that look like? How is the world going to look? How are people's psyches going to look? It's really tricky.
I guess one more question about process. Do you just sit down and write your script scene by scene and you put it all in there? Or is there any part of it that you're creating while you're filming too?
I like to say that I'm a structure queen. And so for me, it's very top down. It's like putting, I know what happens in the whole season, and then I know what happens in each episode. And then from there, you really drill down and get more granular with it. And there's certainly an element of changing things on the fly as issues come up when you're shooting or when you're recording. Unfortunately, my process is procrastinate with great fervor for as much time as I possibly can. And then at a certain point, I feel like physically ill, not because I procrastinated so much, but because like if I don't express it, if I don't get the story out of my brain, I feel like I will explode. And that is when it all comes out.
That's awesome.
Come around, all hot, sweet, unlock the door and unlock the door. Come around.
You You can find all of Adam Goldman's web series on thatadamgoldman.com. And stay tuned for an exciting announcement from Audible about the new project he has in the works. Zeitgeist. The word comes from the German Zeit, or time, and Geist, or ghost. It came to be used in English around 1835 to describe the general cultural climate of an era. Well, Miranda July was in the zeitgeist in 2006 when she came to Yaddo. Her film, Me, You, and Everyone We Know, had just come out. Her debut story collection, No One Belongs Here More Than You, would follow a year later. A headline in her local paper, the Times Union, declared, "Anxiety-ridden souls find salvation in her work." Here she performs a story from that first collection.
"This is how we are different from other animals," she said. "But keep your eyes open so you can see the cloth." We all had white cloth napkins over our faces, and the light glowed through them. It seemed brighter under there, as if the cloth actually filtered out the darkness that was in the rest of the room. The dark rays that come off things and people. The instructor walked around the room as she talked, so that she was everywhere at once. Her face and permed hair were forgotten. There was just the voice and the white light, and these two things combined felt like the truth. "You will never be a part of the world." She was standing quite near. "Humans each make their own worlds in the area in front of their own face." Now she was across the room. "Why do you think that we are the only animal that kisses?" She was near again. "Because the area in front of our faces is our most intimate zone." She drew a breath. "This is why humans are the only romantic animal." We were quiet and wondering under our napkins. How did she know this? What about dogs? Don't dogs feel everything we do times 100? But we couldn't see to form a chain of doubt between each other's eyes. And her voice had a vibrant certainty that made believing her feel liberating and obvious, like the truth was there all along. Why pull your finger back when you can just let it be part of the hand? It is the hand, of course. Fingers and hands are all one thing. These distinctions are like shackles. I see the light. It is coming through the napkin. The tiny world in front of your face is an illusion, and romance itself is an illusion. We gasped, but it was a delayed gasp. We were a slow group. Just the distribution of the napkins had been hard to organize. We had finally settled on take one and pass the rest down. "Romance isn't real, and neither is your world under the cloth. But because you are human, you can never lift the cloth. So you might as well learn how to be the most romantic woman you can be. This is what humans can do. Romance. You may now lift the cloth." We almost felt that we would not be able to, because we were human. But it slid right off. The cloth was just a metaphor, and the auditorium seemed darker than before, and we were 40 women. I had hoped that we would now be another type of animal, one that could be part of the world. But the cloth was just a metaphor, and we were 40 women gathered on a Saturday morning to become more romantic. One woman still had the napkin on her head, possibly asleep. We worked hard because we wanted results. We mirrored each other and we breathed in, no, no, and breathed out, yes, yes. We wrapped our hands around our own ankles and pretended they were someone else's, and then we tried to run and pretended that someone else was trying to run, someone we loved was trying to run away. And we held them by the ankles and we breathed in, no, no, and breathed out, yes, yes, and released the ankles and ran all around the auditorium, 40 women. Then we came back to the circle and talked about pheromones and other kinds of mists. Remember, you don't have to make the whole world romantic or even the whole bedroom. Just the small space in front of your face. A very manageable territory. Even the working women will agree. Because when he looks at you, or she, romance has no biases, he has to look through the air in front of your face. Is that space polluted? Is it rosy? Is it misty? You'll want to think about these questions during the lunch break. We ate our sandwiches and looked at each other through the air in front of our faces. It looked clear, but maybe it wasn't. We thought hard about this while we drank the provided soda. This could change everything. I got up and stood alone in the hallway and pressed my face to the wall. It was wood-paneled and smelled like pee, as so many things do. Romance, my apartment. Romance, my Honda. Romance, my skin condition. Romance, my job. Romance. I turned my head and pressed my other cheek against the wall. The bell was calling us back together for the wrap-up session. Romance. My utter lack of friends who shared my interests. Romance. The soul. Romance. Life on other planets. Romance. I stared down the hall. Someone was down there. It was Teresa, who I'd partnered with during breath mirroring. We had synchronized our breaths, and then syncopated them, and then we had talked about how that felt and which one was more romantic. Syncopated was the right answer. I walked down the hall and saw that Teresa was sitting on the floor next to a chair. This is always a bad sign. It's a slippery slope, and it's best just to sit in chairs, to eat when hungry, to sleep and rise and work. But we've all been there. Chairs are for people, and you're not sure if you are one. I kneeled beside her. I rubbed her back, and then I stopped because I thought it might be too familiar. But that felt cold, so I patted her shoulder, which meant I was only touching her a third of the time. The other 2/3 of the time, my hand was either traveling towards her or away from her. The longer I patted her, the harder it became. I was too aware of the intervals between the pats, and I couldn't find a natural rhythm. I felt like I was hitting a conga drum, and then as soon as I thought of this, I had to beat out a little cha-cha-cha, and Teresa began to cry. I stopped with the patting and hugged her, and she hugged me back. I had made everything just horrible enough to bring Teresa's sadness down to the next level, and I joined her here. It was a place of overflowing collaborative misery, and we cried together. We could smell each other's shampoo and the laundry detergents we had chosen, and I smelled that she didn't smoke, but that someone she loved did. And she could feel that I was large, but not genetically, not permanently, just until I found my way again. And the snaps on our jeans pressed into each other, and our breasts exchanged their tired histories, tales of being over and underutilized, floods and famines, and never mind, just go. We wetted each other's blouses and pushed our crying ahead of us like a lantern, searching out new and forgotten sadnesses, ones that had died politely years ago, but in fact had not died and came to life with a little water. We had loved people we really shouldn't have loved, and then married other people in order to forget our impossible loves. Or we had once called out hello, hello, into the cauldron of the world, and then run away before anyone could respond. Always running and always wanting to go back, but always being further and further away, until it finally was just a scene in a movie where a girl says hello, hello, into the cauldron of the world, and you are just a woman watching the movie with her husband on the couch, and his legs are across your lap, and you have to go to the bathroom. There were things of this general scale to cry about. But the biggest reason to cry was to drench the air in front of our faces. It was romance. Not the falling in love kind, but the sharing of the air in front of our eyes and shoulders and chests and stomachs and thighs. There was so much air to share. Then gradually we slowed, then stopped. And after a long, still pause, goodbye, we broke apart into our respective selves. And then the euphoria came, like warm winds from Hawaii, drying our tears and clearing the path back into the material world. It was a joy to be there, beside the chair. We held each other's hands and laughed with feigned embarrassment, which gradually took hold and became real. We stood, and Teresa wiped off her backside briskly like she had taken a fall. I pulled the cuffs of my cardigan down. We walked down the hall and entered the auditorium just in time to help stack the chairs. There was no system for stacking, so we accidentally made many sub-stacks that were too heavy to lift and join together. The stacks of various heights stood alone like ice floes. We gathered our purses and walked to our cars.
Hello, send my kindest regards to New York. I'm glad. I think I want to settle down, but
Miranda July's new film, Kajillionaire, came out last fall and is now available on, yes, streaming platforms. Special thanks to the New York Public Radio Archive collections for the audio of Romance, with sound designed by Tim Renner. Big thanks, as ever, to our sound engineer, C.J. DeGenero, and to the artists who contributed music. In order of appearance, they are Joseph Keckler for the adaptation of our theme music, Strangers from the Internet, Arthur Moon for the song Homo Normo from their self-titled debut album, which, in the spirit of experimentation, was recorded, quote, in living rooms, home studios, and a casita over the course of many sessions. And thanks for tuning in. Let's all go and dare to fail. We'll see you for more Shadow Yado in a couple of weeks.